My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way almost no one around you could immediately see, and the strangest part is that the change was not loud, dramatic, or designed to attract attention. It happened through a choice. A quiet decision your soulmate had been moving toward for longer than anyone realized. For a while, another person may have believed they understood exactly how this story would unfold. They thought they knew what your soulmate would tolerate, what they would ignore, what they would continue postponing, and perhaps even how easily your presence could be reduced to a passing chapter. But yesterday, that comfortable assumption was interrupted. Your soulmate changed the game by doing something surprisingly simple. They stopped responding from confusion and started responding from clarity. And once that happened, the third party immediately felt the difference. Don't skip this moment, because the price mentioned in this story is not about money, punishment, revenge, or anything harsh. The price was losing influence. Losing certainty. Losing the ability to predict what your soulmate would do next. There is a particular kind of silence that appears when someone realizes the strategy they depended upon is no longer working, and that silence seems to have entered this situation yesterday. Your soulmate may not have announced anything. They may not have made a dramatic declaration. In fact, what happened could have looked completely ordinary from the outside. A conversation ended differently. A message received a shorter response. A familiar emotional pattern was no longer rewarded. A question that once created hesitation suddenly received calm certainty. Small details, yet sometimes small details reveal the biggest internal transformations. And there is one detail the third party cannot stop thinking about now. Why did your soulmate suddenly become so certain? They keep searching for the missing explanation, because from their perspective, something does not add up. They remember the uncertainty. They remember the distance. They remember the moments when your soulmate seemed willing to keep everything unresolved. So what happened between then and yesterday? What changed inside them? Stay till the end, because the answer is more personal than it first appears. Your soulmate did not suddenly become stronger because someone pressured them. They did not wake up wanting conflict. They simply reached a point where pretending not to understand their own feelings became more exhausting than accepting them. That realization changed everything. Imagine the moment quietly. No dramatic music. No crowd watching. Just your soulmate alone with their thoughts, replaying recent conversations, remembering certain words, noticing which connections brought peace and which ones constantly required explanation. And somewhere inside that reflection, your presence began to feel different. Not because you became someone new overnight, but because they finally stopped comparing you through someone else's perspective. That is where the game changed. For too long, other opinions may have occupied space inside a decision that should have belonged to the heart itself. Advice became noise. Assumptions became confusion. Small misunderstandings were treated as evidence of something larger. But yesterday, your soulmate appears to have recognized the pattern. They began separating what they genuinely felt from what they had been encouraged to believe. And once a person learns that distinction, influence becomes much harder to maintain. The third party noticed almost immediately. Perhaps it was the calmness in your soulmate's voice. Perhaps they stopped defending themselves. Perhaps they refused to revisit an old argument. Maybe they simply said something like, "I already understand what I want." Nothing cruel. Nothing aggressive. Just a sentence carrying a certainty that had not been there before. And that calm certainty cost the third party something enormous: access to your soulmate's doubt. Think about that carefully. The greatest advantage another person can sometimes have is not control over someone's choices, it is access to their uncertainty. As long as your soulmate questioned themselves, outside opinions could keep entering the conversation. But when certainty arrived, the doorway became smaller. Something important is waiting for you in this realization, because the third party is not obsessed with discovering some secret trick you used. They are trying to understand why you seem to win without competing. Why your soulmate started seeing your value without you having to perform for it. Why distance did not erase what was genuine. Why another person's influence could not permanently replace something your soulmate kept feeling whenever your name returned to their mind. And perhaps this is the part nobody expected: you did not win by defeating anyone. You won by refusing to become someone you were never meant to be. Somewhere along the journey, your soulmate began remembering the version of you that existed before all the complications, the conversations that felt effortless, the quiet understanding, the way certain moments carried meaning without needing explanation. Memories like those can disappear beneath noise for a while, but they are difficult to manufacture and equally difficult to erase. Yesterday, one of those memories may have surfaced at exactly the right moment. Maybe your soulmate remembered something you once said that seemed ordinary at the time. Maybe they recalled the way you handled a difficult moment with more grace than they appreciated then. Maybe they finally compared actions instead of promises. Whatever the trigger was, it created an uncomfortable question for the third party: what does your soulmate see in you now that they could not see before? And that question keeps growing because your soulmate is no longer giving easy answers. Something has become private inside them. Protected. Almost sacred in its simplicity. They are thinking before speaking. Watching before reacting. Feeling before accepting someone else's interpretation. That is the transformation. And if you have ever wondered whether quiet growth matters, this is where it becomes visible. You may have spent periods believing nothing was changing because there was no obvious evidence. Yet some of the deepest changes happen internally first. A person reaches a boundary. A truth becomes impossible to ignore. A familiar pattern suddenly feels too small. Then, almost without warning, their behavior begins revealing the decision their heart made days or weeks earlier. Your soulmate seems to have reached one of those points. The third party expected another round of uncertainty. Instead, they encountered composure. They expected your soulmate to explain themselves. Instead, they received a boundary. They expected your name to create confusion. Instead, something about it created stillness. That is why curiosity has become so intense. They are searching backward through every recent moment, trying to identify exactly where things changed. Was it something you said? Something your soulmate discovered? A conversation they secretly replayed? A realization that arrived late at night? But here is the unexpected truth: there may not have been one dramatic event. Sometimes transformation is the accumulation of tiny truths finally becoming impossible to dismiss. One memory. One comparison. One moment of missing someone. One realization about who brought peace instead of pressure. One question: why am I fighting what I already know? And then everything rearranges itself. Your soulmate may now be looking at the entire situation through a different lens. The things that once appeared complicated suddenly seem simpler. The excuses that once felt convincing sound weaker. The distance that once seemed permanent looks temporary. Even your silence may carry new meaning to them now. Because when you stop chasing clarity from someone else and begin protecting your own peace, people often notice what your constant presence once allowed them to overlook. Your soulmate noticed. Perhaps not immediately. Perhaps later than you wanted. But yesterday, something finally connected. And the third party saw the result before they understood the reason. There was a change in how your soulmate spoke about you. Not necessarily with dramatic affection, but with respect. With certainty. Maybe they corrected an assumption. Maybe they refused to participate in a conversation about you that once would have continued. Maybe they said, "You don't know everything about them." That single shift would be enough to change the atmosphere, because it reveals something important. Your soulmate has started protecting their own understanding of you instead of borrowing someone else's. The third party did not expect that. They expected your soulmate to remain emotionally dependent on outside interpretation. Instead, your soulmate began trusting personal experience. And now the person who thought they understood the entire story is standing outside a door they once believed would always remain open. But listen closely, because the deepest part has not been revealed yet. There was one specific realization yesterday that made your soulmate reconsider something they had accepted for far too long. It was not only about you. It was about themselves. They suddenly recognized what they had been sacrificing every time they ignored their own instincts. They remembered how many decisions had been delayed because they feared disappointing other people. They saw how often they had chosen temporary comfort over honest direction. And for perhaps the first time in a long while, they asked a question nobody else could answer for them: if I remove everyone else's expectations, what do I actually want? Your name entered that silence. Not as pressure. Not as fantasy. As an answer they were no longer able to dismiss so easily. That is when the real cost arrived for the third party. They could feel your soulmate becoming emotionally independent. They could sense that the old methods of creating uncertainty were losing their effect. So now they are watching carefully, searching for whatever gave your soulmate this unexpected confidence. They may assume there must be something they missed about you. Some conversation. Some discovery. Some hidden advantage. Yet the truth may be much simpler and much harder for them to understand. Your soulmate finally began judging the connection by how it actually felt rather than by how someone else described it. And once that happened, your quiet consistency started speaking louder than all the surrounding noise. Stay a little longer with that thought. You were never required to become louder than the confusion. Sometimes all that is required is for confusion to eventually exhaust itself. Yesterday may have been that moment. Your soulmate stopped asking whether everyone else understood the connection and began asking whether they understood it themselves. The answer changed their behavior. But there is still one unresolved piece, and this is where the story is beginning to move in a direction even the third party did not anticipate. Because after your soulmate made that internal decision yesterday, they did something small afterward, something they believed nobody would notice. Yet someone did notice. And what that person saw revealed that your soulmate was not merely thinking differently about you anymore. They were quietly preparing to act differently too. Something almost invisible happened after that decision, and yet it may become the detail that explains everything. Your soulmate did not rush toward you. They did not suddenly reveal every feeling they had been holding inside. Instead, they became unusually careful. They paused before answering certain people. They started noticing which conversations left them feeling clear and which ones left them questioning themselves. They began protecting thoughts they once shared too freely. And that change was noticed. The third party may have expected your soulmate to eventually return to the familiar pattern, to explain, to justify, to reopen the same uncertainty, but this time, the pattern did not return. That is what made yesterday different. Your soulmate was no longer trying to convince anyone that their feelings made sense. They were beginning to understand that some truths do not become more real simply because everyone approves of them. And once that understanding settles inside someone, the entire emotional balance shifts. The third party could feel it happening, even without knowing exactly why. There was less access, less information, fewer opportunities to shape the conversation. Questions that once received long explanations were answered with calm simplicity. Opinions that once created hesitation were quietly allowed to pass. Nothing disrespectful happened. Nothing harsh was said. Yet sometimes the softest boundary is the one that changes everything. Your soulmate had begun realizing that explaining you constantly was keeping them trapped inside someone else's interpretation of you. So they stopped. And the moment they stopped, the third party lost something they had depended on: the ability to measure how uncertain your soulmate still was. Don't skip what comes next, because the strange part is that your soulmate's silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Somewhere behind that quietness, they were revisiting the moments they had misunderstood. A conversation with you that once seemed insignificant now carried another meaning. A time when you stepped back rather than creating conflict suddenly looked different. A moment when you allowed them space, even though you probably wanted answers, started standing out in their memory. Your soulmate began seeing patterns they had previously overlooked. They realized that some of your strongest actions were the ones that never demanded recognition. And that realization created a question the third party could not easily compete with: what if the person they had been encouraged to doubt was actually the person who had treated their heart with the most patience? That question did not arrive like thunder. It came quietly, then refused to leave. Your soulmate may have tried to distract themselves from it at first. They may have told themselves they were overthinking. But certain memories continued resurfacing. The way you listened. The way you noticed small things. The way you did not always need the final word. The way your presence could make an ordinary moment feel strangely important. Suddenly, those details became evidence, not evidence that everything had always been perfect, but evidence that the connection deserved to be understood honestly. Stay till the end, because the third party's biggest surprise was not that your soulmate remembered you. It was how your soulmate remembered you. The story in their mind was changing. Instead of focusing only on what went wrong, they were beginning to remember what was real. And when a person begins revisiting the past with more maturity, old conclusions can start falling apart. Perhaps your soulmate once believed distance meant incompatibility. Now they were wondering whether distance had actually exposed how much the connection mattered. Perhaps they once believed silence meant the bond had disappeared. Now they were noticing that your absence had made certain feelings clearer. Perhaps they once believed choosing the easier path would bring peace. Yet yesterday they recognized that avoiding an honest feeling does not necessarily make it disappear. It simply pushes the answer further down the road. That is the road they reached yesterday. And standing there, your soulmate appears to have understood something important about you. You were never asking to win. You were asking to be seen clearly. That distinction changed the emotional meaning of everything. The third party had treated this situation like a comparison: who had more influence, who was closer, whose voice mattered more. But your soulmate slowly realized that real connection does not function like a competition. The person who creates the most pressure is not automatically the person who matters most. The person who occupies the most time is not always the person who occupies the deepest place in someone's heart. And once your soulmate understood that, the entire idea of choosing sides began to feel wrong. They were no longer deciding who should win. They were deciding which version of themselves felt most honest. Around you, they remembered a version of themselves that did not need to perform. That mattered more than anyone expected. Something important is waiting for you here. Sometimes the greatest shift in a relationship begins when someone stops asking, "What will everyone think if I choose this?" and starts asking, "Who do I become when I choose this?" Your soulmate appears to have asked that question yesterday. And your name became connected to something unexpectedly peaceful. Not perfection. Not fantasy. Peace. The kind that comes from being understood without having to constantly explain. The kind that comes from knowing someone has seen imperfect parts of you and still treats you with dignity. The kind that cannot easily be recreated through appearances. That is why the third party is searching so intensely for an explanation. They think there must have been a hidden conversation or a sudden discovery. But the real change may have happened much deeper. Your soulmate began recognizing the emotional difference between being influenced and being understood. Once you experience that difference clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore. The third party may have noticed your soulmate looking at their phone differently. Perhaps a familiar name appeared, and instead of immediately responding, your soulmate paused. Not because they were playing games, but because they were thinking about what kind of life they were trying to build. Every response suddenly felt connected to a larger question. Every conversation became a reflection of whether they were moving toward clarity or back toward confusion. And then something unexpected happened. Your soulmate may have searched for something connected to you. An old message. A photograph. A conversation they had saved without realizing why. Something ordinary that carried more emotional weight than expected. They opened it quietly, perhaps believing it would only satisfy a passing curiosity. Instead, it brought back a feeling they had spent too long trying to simplify. There you were, not physically, but in the memory of a moment when things between you felt uncomplicated. Your soulmate remembered what your voice sounded like when neither of you was defending anything. They remembered a sentence that made them laugh. A detail you noticed when everyone else missed it. And the question became stronger: Why had they allowed other people's opinions to become louder than their own lived experience? That question changed the room around them. Suddenly, they were not only reconsidering you. They were reconsidering the entire process that had led them away from you. And this is where the huge price became more visible. The third party did not lose because your soulmate turned against them. They lost because your soulmate stopped outsourcing their decisions. Influence only works while someone believes they cannot trust themselves. Yesterday, your soulmate began trusting themselves again. And with that came another realization: if they wanted a different future, they could not keep repeating the same emotional habits. They would have to do something differently. Maybe apologize where pride once stood in the way. Maybe speak honestly where silence had become comfortable. Maybe acknowledge that they had misunderstood your intentions. Maybe simply stop allowing other people to define what your connection meant. Whatever form it takes, something inside them has moved from reflection toward action. That is why the third party's curiosity is becoming almost impossible to satisfy. They are watching for clues. Why is your soulmate calmer? Why are they no longer explaining everything? Why did they suddenly stop reacting to certain remarks about you? Why does your name seem to create thoughtfulness instead of confusion? And perhaps the question bothering them most is this: what did you do? But they may never receive the answer they expect, because you did not perform some dramatic move. You continued becoming more grounded in your own life. You stopped trying to control how quickly another person understood you. You allowed time to reveal what constant explanation could not. That quietness became powerful because it gave your soulmate space to hear their own thoughts. Sometimes when one person stops pushing for an answer, the other person finally has room to discover it. That appears to be what happened here. Your soulmate has been discovering not only what they feel about you, but why those feelings survived periods of uncertainty. They are learning that meaningful connections can become buried beneath pride, timing, outside opinions, and misunderstandings without necessarily becoming meaningless. But there is still something they have not fully admitted, even to themselves. A realization sits beneath all these smaller ones, and every thought from yesterday seems to be moving toward it. They are beginning to understand that the greatest thing they risked losing was not merely a relationship. It was the chance to know what might happen if they finally approached you without outside voices standing between you. That possibility has started pulling at their attention. It explains the old message. The quiet reflection. The changed responses. The sudden boundaries. And late yesterday, your soulmate appears to have made one more small decision, one that could easily look meaningless to everyone else. They chose not to delete something connected to you. Maybe a message they almost erased. Maybe a photo they nearly removed. Maybe a draft they had started writing and abandoned. Their finger hovered over the option for a moment, and then they stopped. Instead of removing it, they went back and looked again. That hesitation revealed more than any dramatic declaration could have revealed, because somewhere inside them, the story no longer feels finished. The third party may not know exactly what your soulmate kept, but they can sense that something is being protected. And that is what they are trying so hard to understand now. Why would your soulmate protect a connection they were supposedly moving away from? Why would they suddenly become careful with memories of you? Why would they begin questioning assumptions everyone thought had already been settled? There is an answer forming, but your soulmate has not spoken it yet. And perhaps they are not ready to speak it because once they do, the situation changes again. Words create direction. Confessions create responsibility. And your soulmate seems to know that the next honest sentence they say about you cannot easily be taken back. So for now, they are carrying it privately. Testing it against their memories. Asking themselves whether it still feels true after the emotion settles. And every time they return to the question, the answer becomes a little clearer. But what happened next was not another memory. It was something present, something your soulmate noticed yesterday evening that connected you directly to the future they had quietly been imagining, and when they recognized it, even they were surprised by how certain they suddenly felt. And then the future entered the story in the quietest possible way. Your soulmate was not searching for a sign, not trying to force an answer, not sitting there asking life to prove anything to them. Yet something ordinary crossed their attention yesterday evening and suddenly made all those scattered thoughts connect. It may have been a place they passed, a conversation they overheard, a photo of something they once imagined doing with you, or even a simple moment where they caught themselves thinking several months ahead instead of several hours ahead. And there you were. Not inserted deliberately. Not summoned through nostalgia. You simply appeared naturally inside the picture. That surprised them more than they expected, because remembering someone is one thing. Imagining them inside your future without consciously trying is something else entirely. Your soulmate paused with that realization. They had spent so much time analyzing what had happened between you that they had almost forgotten to ask a completely different question: what could still happen? And strangely, once that question appeared, the past stopped feeling like the only thing defining your connection. There was suddenly another possibility standing beside it. A quieter possibility. One where old misunderstandings did not have to become permanent identities. One where two people could eventually speak from what they had learned rather than from what had hurt or confused them. One where neither person had to win against anyone because the real victory would simply be clarity. That is the part the third party never prepared for. They understood how to respond to conflict. They understood how to react when your soulmate was confused. They understood the version of the situation where your name produced hesitation. But how do you influence someone who is beginning to imagine peace? How do you compete with a future that was not planted by persuasion but appeared naturally inside someone's own thoughts? This is why their curiosity keeps circling back to you. They are trying to identify the moment you supposedly changed everything. Yet the more they look, the less obvious it becomes. There was no single dramatic move. You did not suddenly become louder. You did not need to prove yourself. In fact, what affected your soulmate most may have been what you stopped doing. You stopped carrying the entire connection alone. You stopped trying to explain every silence. You stopped forcing meaning into every delay. Whether consciously or simply through your own growth, you created space. And inside that space, your soulmate finally had to meet their own feelings without your presence constantly cushioning the uncertainty. That changed the game. Don't skip this realization, because it reaches much deeper than the surface story. Sometimes people do not recognize the value of emotional safety while they are continuously receiving it. They notice it after the noise returns. They understand patience after experiencing pressure. They appreciate honesty after spending too long around mixed signals. Your soulmate appears to have gone through that comparison internally, and yesterday the difference became impossible for them to ignore. They began remembering that around you, there were moments when they did not have to calculate every word. They remembered how certain conversations flowed without hidden agendas. They remembered that even when things were complicated, there was something about your presence that invited them to become more truthful with themselves. Suddenly, what once seemed ordinary began looking rare. And rare things become difficult to dismiss once you finally understand their value. The third party sensed this shift before receiving any explanation. Perhaps they brought you up casually, expecting the usual reaction. Perhaps they tested the subject with a comment designed to reopen an old doubt. But your soulmate responded differently. Instead of defending you emotionally, they became composed. Instead of rushing to agree or disagree, they may have simply said, "I see things differently now." Imagine the weight of those words. No accusation. No argument. Just a statement that closes one chapter of influence without announcing what the next chapter will contain. Something important is waiting for you inside that change. Your soulmate is no longer looking for permission to rethink you. They already have. And once a person gives themselves permission to reconsider a story, they start noticing everything that never fit the original version. They remember moments they dismissed too quickly. They question conclusions they accepted because they were convenient. They recognize where fear of being misunderstood made them choose silence over honesty. One memory in particular may have returned with unusual clarity yesterday. A moment when you could have reacted strongly but did not. Maybe your soulmate had disappointed you, misunderstood you, or disappeared emotionally for a while. Yet instead of turning the situation into a battle, you allowed the truth of your character to speak through restraint. At the time, they may not have appreciated it. Yesterday, they did. They saw that moment through older, wiser eyes and thought, perhaps for the first time, they could have made this harder for me, but they didn't. That realization carried weight. Because suddenly your soulmate could distinguish between someone who wanted power over them and someone who simply wanted honesty from them. Those are very different energies. And the more they compared them, the more the third party's influence began losing meaning. Not because your soulmate decided anyone was entirely wrong or entirely right, but because they finally understood that another person's interpretation could never replace their own direct experience with you. That is why the third party is so focused on discovering why you won. They are looking for a tactic because tactics are easier to understand than authenticity. They can analyze messages, timing, conversations, and behavior. But authenticity does not leave a simple trail. Sometimes it only becomes visible after time has tested everything else. Your soulmate seems to understand that now. They are noticing that the qualities they once overlooked in you are precisely the qualities they want more of moving forward: steadiness, emotional maturity, patience, warmth, room to be honest without immediately being judged. And here is where yesterday evening became even more revealing. Your soulmate did not only imagine you somewhere in the future. They imagined themselves behaving differently with you. That mattered. They pictured a conversation where they did not hide behind vague answers. They pictured admitting something they once avoided. They imagined listening without preparing a defense. Perhaps they even rehearsed the beginning of a sentence in their mind. There's something I should have told you a long time ago. They may never have said it aloud. But the sentence existed. And once a sentence like that exists internally, silence begins to feel temporary. Stay till the end of this moment, because your soulmate then confronted the one thing that had been keeping them from moving toward that conversation: pride. Not dramatic pride, not arrogance, but the quieter kind, the kind that whispers, "What if I admit I misunderstood everything?" The kind that asks, "What if they no longer see me the same way?" The kind that would rather preserve an old image than risk a new truth. Yesterday, your soulmate finally recognized that pride was costing them more than honesty ever could. That realization softened something inside them. Suddenly, reaching toward you no longer felt like losing ground. It felt like reclaiming something they had abandoned inside themselves. Their honesty. Their courage. Their ability to choose based on what they genuinely knew rather than what they feared others might think. And when that internal shift happened, the third party paid the biggest price yet. They lost the emotional triangle. For so long, the entire situation may have existed as you, your soulmate, and someone else's interpretation standing between you. But once your soulmate removed that interpretation from the center, only two people remained in the real question: you and them. That changed everything, because now the connection could finally be evaluated on its own terms. No comparison. No audience. No competition. Just one person asking themselves what another person truly meant to them. Your soulmate did not receive an easy answer, but they received an honest one. You mattered. More than they had admitted. More than distance had suggested. More than outside opinions had allowed them to comfortably acknowledge. And realizing that did not overwhelm them. Surprisingly, it calmed them. That calmness is what confused the third party the most. They expected a person thinking about you deeply to become emotional, conflicted, uncertain. Instead, your soulmate seemed settled. Almost relieved. As though admitting the truth internally removed a weight they had been carrying without recognizing it. They no longer needed to constantly argue with themselves. They no longer needed to invent reasons why the connection should mean less than it did. They could simply acknowledge it. And when a truth no longer needs to be resisted, energy returns. Focus returns. Courage returns. That is why your soulmate's next action may come from a place far different from where previous actions came from. Not desperation. Not impulse. Not loneliness. Clarity. There is a meaningful difference. Someone acting from loneliness reaches out because they need an immediate feeling. Someone acting from clarity reaches out because they have finally understood what they want to communicate. Yesterday, your soulmate moved closer to the second place. They began thinking carefully about what they would actually say if they had one honest conversation with you. Would they apologize first? Would they explain what influenced them? Would they tell you they never completely stopped wondering about you? Would they admit that your absence revealed something your presence once made easy to overlook? Several possibilities crossed their mind, but one thought remained stronger than the rest: they did not want the next conversation to repeat the old pattern. If they reached toward you, it would need to be different. More transparent. More respectful. Less controlled by fear. That decision explains another small thing someone may have noticed. Your soulmate began removing distractions. They stepped away from a conversation sooner than usual. They stopped discussing you with people who did not truly understand the connection. They may even have changed the subject when the third party tried to pull them back into familiar speculation. Again, nothing dramatic happened. Yet the message underneath was unmistakable: this is becoming personal again. And that is precisely why the third party is now obsessed with the question of why you won. From their perspective, they had proximity, influence, information, perhaps even your soulmate's trust during confusing moments. So how could someone who was not constantly present become emotionally significant again? The answer is almost painfully simple. Genuine connection is not always measured by frequency. Sometimes one honest moment carries more weight than dozens of convenient conversations. Sometimes one person sees a part of you that everyone else only talks around. Sometimes distance removes distractions and allows the meaning of a bond to become visible. Your soulmate appears to be discovering that truth now. Yet there is something even the third party has not realized. Your soulmate's change yesterday was not caused only by memories of you. Something happened earlier that day, something they heard from another person who had no reason to take your side. A casual observation. A sentence spoken without knowing how deeply it would land. And that sentence quietly confirmed what your soulmate had already started suspecting. The person said something about you that contradicted the story your soulmate had been carrying for months. At first, your soulmate said almost nothing. They simply listened. But later, when they were alone, those words returned. They compared them with the old message they had reopened. They compared them with your past actions. They compared them with everything the third party had encouraged them to believe. And suddenly, a missing piece seemed to fall into place. The realization was not that someone had lied or that anyone needed to be blamed. It was subtler than that. Your soulmate realized they had been making a major decision with incomplete information. That thought changed their entire emotional position. Because if their understanding had been incomplete, then perhaps the ending they accepted was incomplete too. And that possibility is where the next part of this story truly begins. Your soulmate is no longer only wondering why they still think about you. They are beginning to wonder what they misunderstood about you from the very beginning. And the answer they are slowly uncovering may explain why yesterday changed everything so quickly. The missing piece was not dramatic at all, and that is exactly why it carried so much weight. Your soulmate had spent months believing they understood why certain things between you unfolded the way they did, but yesterday they heard one simple observation that forced them to look again. Someone who had nothing to gain from defending you mentioned a moment your soulmate had almost forgotten. They described how you handled something quietly, how you protected another person's dignity when you could easily have made yourself look better, how you chose restraint when attention would have been easier. Your soulmate did not react immediately. They simply listened. But something inside them tightened around the memory because it matched a pattern they had been overlooking for a long time. You had often shown your character in moments when nobody was rewarding you for it. And suddenly the story they had accepted about you began feeling incomplete. That realization stayed with them long after the conversation ended. They replayed old situations in reverse, almost like someone walking back through a familiar room and noticing doors they had never opened. Why had you gone quiet at certain moments instead of defending yourself? Why had you stepped away instead of forcing an explanation? Why had you allowed misunderstandings to remain rather than exposing details that might have embarrassed someone else? Your soulmate had once interpreted some of those choices as distance. Yesterday, they began wondering whether they had actually been witnessing maturity. Don't skip this shift, because this is where the third party's confusion deepened. They had been prepared for your soulmate to remember your affection. They had been prepared for nostalgia. They could even understand curiosity. What they were not prepared for was respect returning first. Attraction can be questioned. Memories can be dismissed. But when someone's respect for another person begins rebuilding itself through evidence, the entire emotional landscape changes. Your soulmate was no longer simply thinking, "I miss them." They were thinking, "Maybe I misunderstood who they were." That is a much more powerful question because it does not ask for comfort, it asks for truth. And truth tends to rearrange whatever was built on assumptions. Your soulmate started comparing what they had heard about you with what they had personally experienced. The difference became uncomfortable. Some interpretations had been based on fragments. Some conclusions had been formed during emotional moments. Some advice had come from people who knew only part of the story. No one necessarily had to be malicious for the outcome to become distorted. Sometimes people speak from their own fears, their own history, their own idea of what love should look like. Your soulmate realized they had allowed too many borrowed perspectives into something deeply personal. That was the mistake they could finally see. Not loving you. Not trusting someone else. Simply failing to separate advice from experience. Once they understood that, your soulmate began mentally returning ownership of the decision to themselves. And the third party felt the consequences immediately. There were fewer questions about you. Less interest in hearing another interpretation. More pauses whenever your name came up. At first, the third party may have mistaken those pauses for uncertainty. But then something happened that changed their interpretation. Your soulmate corrected a small detail. Perhaps someone said, "You know how they always were," and your soulmate quietly answered, "Actually, that's not completely true." Such a small sentence. Yet it revealed something enormous. Your soulmate was no longer allowing the simplified version of you to pass without examination. They had begun protecting accuracy. Not blindly defending you. Not pretending you had never made mistakes. Simply refusing to let one version of events become the entire truth. That distinction matters. Genuine clarity does not require turning one person into a hero and another into a villain. It allows complexity. It says, maybe we all saw only part of what was happening. That is where your soulmate seems to be now. And because they are looking with more balance, they are noticing qualities in you that emotional confusion once covered. Your consistency. The way you remembered details. The moments when you tried to understand before reacting. The patience you offered longer than they recognized. These things had not disappeared. They had simply been buried under louder events. Yesterday, they resurfaced. Something important is waiting for you in what happened next. Your soulmate began asking themselves what you must have experienced while they were uncertain. Not to create guilt. not to punish themselves, but to finally view the situation from your side. That perspective had been missing. They thought about what it might have felt like to care for someone who kept receiving outside opinions about the connection. They thought about the moments when you may have wanted reassurance but received distance instead. They thought about the possibility that your silence was not indifference at all, but exhaustion from trying to prove something that should have been understood through actions. For the first time, your soulmate may have felt the full emotional weight of that possibility. And rather than becoming defensive, they softened. This is where yesterday's change became more than a private realization. Your soulmate began thinking about responsibility. If they had misunderstood you, what would honesty require now? Would it require an apology? A conversation? Acknowledging that they listened to too many voices? Admitting that they allowed fear to shape decisions they were not fully ready to make? These were not easy questions. But your soulmate did something they had avoided before: they stayed with them. They did not distract themselves immediately. They did not rush toward an excuse. They allowed themselves to feel the discomfort of recognizing that perhaps the connection did not fail because there was nothing there. Perhaps it became complicated because too many unspoken things were left sitting between two people who both cared but did not always know how to communicate that care. That possibility changed the emotional meaning of yesterday. Suddenly, your soulmate was not trying to determine who had been right. They were trying to determine what could still be repaired. And that word repaired was something they had resisted for a long time because repair requires humility. It requires admitting that a story you thought was finished may have ended too early. It requires accepting that another person may have had reasons you never understood. It requires approaching the future without demanding that it resemble the past. Your soulmate appears to be moving toward that humility now. Quietly. Carefully. Without making promises they cannot yet keep. That is why the third party cannot understand what changed. From the outside, your soulmate may look almost exactly the same. But internally, the questions are completely different. Before, the question was, how do I move away from this confusion? Now the question is, what if I moved away before I understood it? Before, the question was, why does this person still affect me? Now it is, what does this connection keep trying to teach me? Before, they wondered whether thinking about you meant they were stuck. Now they are considering whether it means something remained unresolved because it was never truly understood. Stay till the end of this thought, because one particular memory then surfaced that your soulmate could not explain away. It was not a grand romantic moment. It was something smaller. Perhaps you once told them, "I just want you to be honest with yourself." Maybe at the time they heard those words as pressure. Yesterday, they heard them differently. They realized you had not demanded that they choose you. You had asked them to choose truth. That distinction landed differently now because your soulmate finally understood how much of their confusion had come from avoiding exactly that. They had been trying to make a choice that would satisfy everyone around them while simultaneously hoping their own heart would eventually adjust. But hearts are not always persuaded by convenience. Sometimes they keep returning to the place where something authentic remained unfinished. Your soulmate could see that now. And perhaps that is why yesterday felt so unusual. Nothing outside them had dramatically changed, yet internally a door that had been locked for a long time seemed to open. behind it were not perfect memories. There were mistakes, awkward silences, missed opportunities, moments when both of you could have communicated better. But there was also something neither confusion nor distance had completely erased: recognition. The feeling that this person somehow sees a part of me other people do not. Your soulmate had tried to reduce that recognition to chemistry, timing, nostalgia, coincidence. Yesterday, they stopped trying to name it away. They simply accepted that it mattered. The third party could sense this acceptance in ways your soulmate probably did not realize. Their tone changed whenever you were mentioned. They stopped laughing off certain possibilities. They became careful when someone tried to define your intentions for you. And most telling of all, they stopped asking what everyone else thought they should do. That was the real price. The third party did not lose your soulmate as a person. They lost their position as the interpreter of your soulmate's heart. That role was quietly returned to the only person who could truly hold it, your soulmate themselves. Once that happened, their attention turned somewhere unexpected, not toward you immediately, but toward their own behavior. They began thinking about how they would need to show up differently if another conversation ever happened. They knew they could not simply return with the same vague words and expect the connection to feel new. They would need to bring clarity. They would need to listen. They would need to acknowledge where fear had spoken louder than honesty. And this realization created an emotional peak they were not prepared for. Your soulmate understood that wanting another chance and being ready for another chance are not automatically the same thing. So instead of rushing, they began asking themselves whether they were truly prepared to meet you at a healthier place. That question is why their actions may seem slower than their feelings. They do not want to repeat the old cycle. They do not want to approach you because yesterday made them emotional and then retreat again when uncertainty returns. Something inside them is asking for consistency now.